What if I told you that the same formula meant to grow money quietly works in reverse for most people? And the longer it runs, the harder it becomes to stop. In this video, I'll explain how interest compounds against you in the simplest way possible. No confusing terms, no financial advice, just education to help you understand how the system really works. When people hear the word compounding, they usually imagine growth, something positive, something that helps money multiply over time. And mathematically, that's true. Compounding simply means that a number doesn't just grow on its original value, it grows on its past growth as well. But here's the part most people don't pause to consider. Compounding itself is neutral. It doesn't care whether it's helping you or working against you. It just follows rules. When compounding is attached to savings, it feels slow at first and powerful later. When compounding is attached to savings, it feels slow at first and powerful later. When compounding is attached to debt, it feels manageable at first and overwhelming later. Same mechanism, different direction. Interest wasn't created to punish people. It exists to price time and risk. When money is used today instead of later, there's a cost attached to that usage. That cost is expressed as interest. From a system perspective, interest does three things at once. It compensates the lender for waiting. It prices uncertainty. It creates predictability in cash flow. On paper, this looks balanced. Borrower gets access, lender gets compensation. Everyone agrees to the terms. But compounding quietly changes how those terms behave over time. At the start, interest feels small because it's calculated on a smaller base. Early payments look reasonable. Statements don't feel threatening. The system appears calm. Then, something subtle happens. Interest gets added back to the balance. The base number grows, and the next calculation uses this new, larger base. From that point onward, interest is no longer working on the original amount alone. It's working on accumulated interest as well. The formula doesn't reset, it remembers. This is where time stops being neutral. The longer the balance exists, the more the formula favors whoever controls the terms of time. Compounding against you doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't feel aggressive. In fact, it often feels invisible. Payments continue, life continues, but under the surface, the math accelerates. What changes isn't just the balance, it's the speed at which the balance reacts to time. Missing small reductions early matters more than people realize. Not because of penalties, but because of how the formula stacks growth on top of growth. The system isn't rushing, it's patient. With simple interest, time adds cost in a straight line. You can roughly predict where you'll end up. With compounding interest, time bends the line. The curve steepens, and that curve doesn't become obvious until much later, when reversing it becomes harder. That's why many people are surprised not by the first year, but by the 5th, 7th, or 10th. The math didn't change, only the timeline did. From an institutional point of view, compounding creates stability. It ensures that long timelines generate increasing returns without constant renegotiation. Systems prefer formulas that reward consistency and patience. Compounding does exactly that. For the side that controls duration. This isn't about intent, it's about design. Once a compounding structure is in place, it doesn't need active pressure. Time does the work. When you look at interest this way, it stops feeling random. It starts feeling directional. And once direction becomes visible, the system becomes easier to understand, even before anything is changed. Most people don't actively choose to let compounding work against them. What usually happens is quieter than that. It begins with decisions that feel harmless, sensible even. Decisions that don't trigger alarm because nothing breaks immediately. The system allows these choices to continue smoothly, and that's exactly why they're so effective. In the early stages, interest rarely feels dangerous. Payments go through. Statements arrive on time. Balances don't look extreme. Everything appears under control. This comfort creates a false sense of stability. When the cost feels small, the mind stops monitoring it closely. And once attention drops, time quietly takes over. The system doesn't require mistakes to be dramatic. It only requires them to be consistent. One of the most common patterns is leaving balances partially unresolved for long periods. Not because people don't care, but because urgency doesn't exist yet. A small remaining balance doesn't feel worth prioritizing. A slight delay doesn't feel meaningful. A minimum payment doesn't feel like a trap. But compounding doesn't measure urgency. It measures duration. As long as the balance exists, the formula continues running. Not aggressively, steadily. And over time, steady beats urgent. Another subtle problem is how payments are psychologically framed. When people see themselves paying regularly, they assume progress is being made. But compounding doesn't care about effort. It only responds to math. If payments don't meaningfully reduce the base, the formula continues to operate on nearly the same number. From the system's perspective, nothing has changed. This is where many people feel confused later on. They remember paying consistently, yet the outcome doesn't reflect that memory. The effort was real. The impact was limited. Most decisions around interest are made with short timelines in mind: immediate relief, temporary flexibility, this month's comfort. But compounding runs on long timelines by default. It rewards whoever plans further ahead. When short-term thinking meets long-term formulas, friction builds quietly. The system doesn't correct this mismatch, it benefits from it. Not because of intent, because of structure. There's an assumption that if something is harmful, it will feel harmful early. Compounding doesn't work that way. Its cost is delayed, its pressure is gradual, its effect is cumulative. By the time discomfort becomes visible, the formula has already done most of its work. What feels sudden at that stage is actually the result of years of quiet accumulation. The system didn't speed up. Awareness just arrived late. Over time, people begin to accept interest as background noise, a permanent expense, something that just exists. This normalization is one of the strongest enablers of compounding working against someone. Once a cost becomes invisible, it stops being questioned, and anything that isn't questioned gets time. None of these patterns come from recklessness. They come from everyday thinking applied to long-term formulas. Compounding doesn't need people to fail. It only needs them to underestimate how quietly time can shift the balance. When compounding works against someone, it's tempting to frame the situation as a personal failure. But from a system perspective, that framing misses the point. Compounding doesn't respond to intentions, it responds to structure. And the people who avoid being pulled by it don't do so by fighting the system. They do it by understanding how the system thinks. Smart users don't treat financial systems as emotional experiences. They treat them as mechanical processes. They assume the system will behave exactly as designed, every time, without empathy, without flexibility. Once that assumption is made, behavior changes naturally, not because of fear, but because expectations are aligned with reality. Most people see time as something that happens to them. Smart system thinkers see time as a lever that can amplify outcomes in either direction. They don't rush because the system isn't emotional. They don't delay because the system doesn't forget. They recognize that duration itself is power. Whoever controls how long a formula runs controls the result. This mental shift is subtle, but it's decisive. One of the most important differences in thinking is how urgency is handled. Urgency feels productive, but systems don't respond to panic. They respond to consistency. Smart behavior isn't about reacting faster. It's about reducing unnecessary exposure to time-based formulas. This is why emotional decisions often worsen compounding effects. They create irregular patterns that the system doesn't correct, it exploits. Institutions don't rely on predictions. They rely on averages and timelines. They design rules that work even when individuals behave inconsistently. Compounding fits perfectly into this model because it doesn't require precision, only persistence. From this perspective, interest isn't a feature, it's a stabilizer. It ensures that over long periods, the system remains predictable, even if individual behavior isn't. Short-term relief feels rational when pressure is present, but relief is temporary by definition. Systems are not. Smart thinkers separate comfort from control. They understand that comfort now doesn't equal advantage later. This isn't about sacrifice, it's about alignment. When behavior aligns with how systems calculate outcomes, friction decreases. When it doesn't, compounding fills the gap. The most powerful change isn't a specific action. It's a shift in how decisions are framed. Instead of asking, what feels manageable right now? The question becomes, how does this interact with time? That single change in perspective neutralizes much of compounding's hidden power, without fighting the system at all. Once behavior starts aligning with structure, compounding loses its mystery. Not because it disappears, but because it stops working in silence. At this point, interest no longer looks like a random cost or an unavoidable burden. It looks like a system that behaves exactly as it was designed to behave. And that realization changes how control is understood. Awareness doesn't magically reduce numbers. It doesn't cancel formulas. It doesn't stop time. What it does is remove surprise. When compounding is understood, outcomes stop feeling unfair or sudden. They feel predictable, and predictability is a form of control. The system doesn't lose power, but it stops hiding it. Fear around money usually comes from uncertainty, from not knowing where things are heading or why they feel harder over time. Compounding creates fear only when it's invisible. Once it's visible, fear is replaced by logic. Logic doesn't rush. Logic doesn't panic. Logic observes patterns and adjusts expectations. This is why understanding systems matters more than memorizing numbers. When someone truly understands how compounding works against them, they stop expecting short timelines to fix long formulas. They stop being surprised by slow beginnings and steep endings. They stop confusing effort with impact. Most importantly, they stop personalizing outcomes that are mathematical by nature. The system doesn't judge, it calculates. There's a misconception that control means constant action. In reality, with time-based systems, control often comes from restraint, from knowing when not to extend timelines, from recognizing when duration is the real cost, from understanding that some systems don't need to be challenged, only respected. When expectations match structure, resistance drops. Interest compounding against you isn't a trick, it isn't a punishment, and it isn't a personal failure. It's what happens when a neutral formula runs longer than most people anticipate. Once that's understood, money stops feeling like an emotional opponent and starts looking like a system governed by rules. And systems, once understood, are far less intimidating. This content is for educational purposes only. It is not financial advice. If this helped you understand the system better, consider subscribing for more educational breakdowns like this.